Hello. This session is for anyone teaching, regardless of stage, age or subject, to help explore the effective use of multiple choice questions in the classroom. There will be a particular focus on diagnosing learning loss and how multiple choice questions can support both teacher and learner workload. Cambridge Assessment includes several expert assessment organisations, and in this session we're from Cambridge International, Cambridge Maths and the Cambridge Network. I'm delighted to introduce Rachel Horseman, as Cambridge Maths lead, and Simon Child is Head of Assessment Training, and I'm Andrew Field, e-learning manager at Cambridge International. Now, during this presentation, we will move between discussions like this and showing some examples on slides. So I'd like to start. What do we consider is effective questioning? What are the advantages of multiple choice questions to support teaching and learning? Rachel?
So I've been thinking about this a lot, and I mean, firstly, I think it's worth considering, why do we ask questions? And there's lots of research about why we ask questions and different reasons in the classroom, down to just even, occupying some students and keeping them on task. If it's a behaviour management tool. But I think some of the things you see in the research, in particular by people like Dylan William, they talk about it's about making students or learners engage their brains. It's making them think. And really importantly, it's about providing information to the teacher about their next steps. Are they ready to move on? Is there something they need to recap? Is there something they need to reteach? And if you get that wrong, things can go quite wrong in the classroom or online quite quickly. If you recap the wrong bits, students can be disengaged. If you reteach when it's not needed, are you wasting time? And if you move on and students aren't ready, there's some dangers there. So really kind of identifying the right questions to ask at the right time can give you so much information about the progression of your lesson. For me, that's kind of real central to it. And I think multiple choice questions offer some really excellent ways to do that, whilst also not overloading teachers, particularly at this time when we're working online.
Okay, thank you. Multiple choice questions. There's often a lot of myths about these and beliefs about what they can be used for and what they can't be used for. Simon, any thoughts?
Yes, that's actually one of the most interesting parts about MCQs. Is actually that they're given there are certain perceptions that persist with multiple choice questions, even when people are using them in effective ways in the classroom and in assessment more generally. Some tend to persist, though. One of the myths is that MCQ assessments, are only good for assessing a particular thing, which is sort of the rote recall of knowledge. And with some examples, we can possibly bust that myth in the next slide or two. And this is something you may be familiar with, Bloom's taxonomy. And you can see that lower order learning, so remembering and understanding it towards the bottom end of the taxonomy, are things that we most naturally associate perhaps with MCQ questions. But what I wanted to get across here was the idea that higher order learning, so the applying, analysing and evaluating, can actually be accessed with skilled MCQ examples. And just to give an example here related to the idea of analysis. An example here is you could show someone a poem in class, and then you ask the question related to a particular stanza. So this is a multiple choice question with an objective correct answer, which has all the benefits of for students in terms of knowing what it is that they need to do as part of the response to the question. But also as an assessor, as someone looking to understand what the students know, you can see that if students answer correctly in this sense, they've been able to analyse the actual ambitions and the aims of that particular stanza, in this case stanza 9. So with those in mind, there are perhaps other misconceptions that could be held as well. Do
you see how I seamlessly put that forward there?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah. One of the other misconceptions that tends to persist is the idea that somehow MCQs are easier, and I think that links to this idea of MCQs being associated with lower level knowledge recall. So as was shown on the previous slide, analysis and evaluation can be assessed using MCQs. But they're also interesting in that the difficulty of MCQs is actually somewhat determined not just by the correct answer option, but also by the plausibility of the distractors that you include. We'll see some examples later on of ones related to common misconceptions. So whilst they're not easy in the sense of being easy to respond correctly to, they have the advantage of students are aware of what is expected of them when they're given a question. They have to mark a piece of paper or click on a computer. So in that sense, it's easier in the way that students have a realistic expectation of what is expected of them. Whereas compared to, say, essay-based questions, the strategy for responding appropriately may not be as fully set. Another misconception is perhaps that they cause teaching to the test. This again seems to be related to the idea that MCQs encourage knowledge-based to be learned in a rote recall fashion. And as I think we'll explore in later parts of this session, MCQs actually have a lot of rich potential in the classroom for classroom practice for encouraging good teaching, and can actually build a dialogic interaction in the classroom. So using MCQs and analysing student responses can be a powerful teaching and learning moment. And the final one that we'll look at as well is the idea that they're simple to write. They're simple to write, but they're hard to write well. So at Cambridge Assessment, we have to invest a lot of money actually and time and so on in the development of high quality MCQs. So question accessibility, content appropriateness, and review are all parts of what we look at. So choosing good distractors is in particular an important element of MCQ questions. So that's why we often recommend that several people are part of the process of writing MCQs at different stages of development. So that's that myth busted as well, hopefully.
Okay, thank you so much. It's really good to sort of explore those things, because this is how we can empower all our teachers to have confidence with multiple choice questions. So in that regard, could we explore some examples of how multiple choice questions can work in practice? Maybe sort of focusing on maths to start with.
That would be wonderful. I think one of the things that particularly in mathematics and other subjects is the idea of misconceptions. If we think about why a student gets a question wrong, is it that they don't know the content? Is it a careless error? Is it misuse of existing knowledge? Or is it something based in a misconception? So a kind of a typically held belief where something's been misinterpreted. In maths, it's often that things have been overgeneralised. Simplest case was I've witnessed primary students, younger learners who think decimal places only ever go to 2 places because they've dealt with money and they take that on into their later learning. Now, what kind of carefully crafted multiple choice questions can do is really pull out those misconceptions. So mathematicians or people who've recently done some work on circles might recognise this. So a typical question of what's the area of this circle in square centimetres. You've been given a measurement and you've been given 4 answers. Now, each one of those answers has been carefully chosen because it picks at a particular problem that you might have. It might be that students are not using the radius or the diameter in the correct way. So one of those picks at that. I'm going to leave you to tell you which. I'm not going to tell you the answers because that would do your job for you. Another one looks at, have they just used the wrong formulae? So have they used formula for the circumference instead of the area? And another one again looks at, have they used the radius and the diameter and the wrong formula? So you're able to kind of pick at things. And what's really interesting afterwards, particularly with these ones, is you could have a series of these that hone down the errors, but also this is a great discussion point. You know, I say, right, I think it's A, and everyone says, no, you're wrong, and I said, well, no, but I think it's A, and you can really investigate, why do I think it's A, what's it, misconception. So it's not just the teacher thinking about the misconception, it's the students talking about those misconceptions, which can offer really quality discussions about, well, what has that student done wrong.
That's such a great point. So I think I was just going to say there, just in terms of a teacher feeling confident to use these are not replacing teaching or anything like that. These are enhancing the teacher, aren't they? So you start those formative questions. It's really powerful, as you just said.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting when you look at these. You know, say I've just noticed my lettering there is terrible. But if I pick that 36 pi, why would a student pick 36 pi? And having that discussion about, well, why is that the wrong answer? What do you think they've got wrong? Really deepens the conversation about the mathematics rather than just the answer is it's right, it's wrong. And the other type that I've been looking at a lot is something called Hinge questions. Now, these are multiple choice questions, and you can read a lot about these by Dylan William, and they're beginning to appear on the web now. Now, a Hinge question is a carefully designed multiple choice question. It is something that's not done lots and lots of them. You have one question that really digs deeply into a particular topic, into a particular kind of crux of I need to move on. If students have got this, I can move on. If they haven't got this, I'm going to have to work out why have they not got it, what are the misconceptions. So this is a very simple one of which of those lines has a gradient of 2, and the answers are carefully designed. Each of them, if you pick them, one of them is correct, one of them is really picking at recognising the importance of scale, another is looking at whether students are calculating the gradient or the reciprocal. Answers have been carefully designed given previous work. So these answers were designed due to the answers that students had done in previous lessons. So the teacher had really thought about what is the question I want to ask, what's that kind of gatekeeper concept to move on, and what are the mistakes students have made previously. I'm going to suggest those and see which of those students have overcome them. And that gives that teacher great confidence then at either saying, I can move on, everybody's got it, or just saying, hang on a second, there are still a few misconceptions that are worth me recapping, either with individuals or with the class as a whole. So hugely potential of really understanding where your students are.
That's great. Thank you so much. And Simon, we're exploring sort of practical examples here. So I believe you're going to mention about higher order opportunities and skills.
Yes, just building on that idea of going from knowledge. Multiple choice questions, as mentioned in the myth section before, is generally seen as about knowledge recall. But I just wanted to show an example from psychology about how a question that is initially about knowledge can almost be reviewed and converted into a higher order skill. So taking this example from psychology, this is to do with the memory systems in the brain. So which sensory memory system is specific to the processing of auditory information? And the answer is echoic memory. If you look at the next example, this idea is essentially giving the same type of options available. So it's a multiple choice question. Which one of the following sensory memory systems does a piano tuner mainly use in his occupation, his or her occupation? So the idea around this is that they will have an understanding of what the different memory systems do, but they will also have to understand the role that a piano tuner has and apply the knowledge that they have around sensory memory to the particular application of how a piano tuner goes about their work. You may have noticed actually as well from the two examples that if you change the distractors, you can actually make the different options more plausible. For people that know about psychology, these examples here are all versions of sensory memory. If you look back at the previous example, if you just go back to the previous example here, these different distractors are not actually forms of sensory memory system. So for the student who's gone through a process of learning about these systems, this particular question here may have less plausible distractors than the application example. So that's another way that you can increase the demand of that particular example and take it from knowledge recall and recognition to higher order skills. So that's just a couple of examples of how you can change and manipulate multiple choice questions to get to those higher order level abilities.
That's great, thank you. And you mentioned distractors there, just for the uninitiated. Let's pretend that's me. Distractors.
Yes. So in MCQ terminology, the distractors are the options that a student can choose, but are incorrect. And the key is the correct option. So that's the terminology for you there.
All right, thank you. And I think, as we're going to mention a little bit later, the challenge in writing such questions is having appropriate distractors, because if you can always guess the key, they're little use.
Yes,
okay.
That's true.
And the other thing I wanted to just sort of briefly mention was how if you use multiple choice questions in a different way, so what we can do there is actually put the learner, the student, in charge of them, and sort of have the student as the teacher. I remember when I was teaching, if I wrote a multiple choice question, obviously I was a quiz, I was particularly enthused and energized, and I would encourage a whole class to be the same. But the moment you put that challenge onto the learners themselves, that changes the dynamic quite effectively, and it actually in itself becomes a teaching tool. And looking at the complexity of writing a question, exploring the distractors, the key, all of those things that in themselves become a really good learning activity. And one of the areas sort of I'd like us to keep exploring is the power of multiple choice questions, not just on their own, but it's what then happens, sort of what you do after the questions. You can even just have a discussion with learners about how challenging it is to actually produce such questions, and what it's not just really learning for what might be appearing in an exam. You're actually using these to really push the boundaries of what's possible, what they can explore further. So just another interesting thing to look at in terms of how they can be used in the classroom. So exploring this a little bit further, we do need to consider, when we're designing multiple choice questions, what are the important considerations. So Simon, you were going to mention a little bit about that, and sort of a lot of this comes from the training that Cambridge Network do deliver, and we'll be sharing details of that afterwards. But in terms of designing multiple choice questions and the best ways to do these things, we're sort of exploring what those key considerations are. So that will appear seamlessly here in a moment as well. So let's see.
Yeah, so I just wanted to break down the idea of that multiple choice assessment and individual item writing can mostly take three broad stages. And when you're taking part in the design of MCQs, I wanted to give you a few questions to consider and to help you in that particular process. So the first stage, planning, the first main consideration is to think about the purpose for your particular MCQ assessment. For example, is it planning to take place at the end of a lesson as a set of Hinge questions, or is it to do with the idea of misconception identification, or do you have more summative reasons for using an MCQ? And related to that is the idea of how you use the outcomes. Do you have a particular plan in mind for how you'll use the information and the data that comes out of it? The next stage of planning is the idea of what topics do you want to cover? And also the final thing is, when do you plan on using the assessment questions? So all to do with timing. Is it after a period of learning? Is it before a period of learning? Or do you want to compare the before and after later on with different sets of MCQ questions? So it's all about this idea of creating your plan and your blueprints for why you're designing the particular assessment that you're thinking of, or the specific items.
Okay.
So the next stage would be the actual writing of the question itself, and this mostly forms into this set of stages. So selecting the learning outcome and the content to test. So that's related to the planning, as I mentioned before. Setting the particular context. So this may be a particular scenario or an example that you're interested in. A really useful thing to do as well is to write the STEM and the key option, so that the correct answer is one true statement. So if you line out a full sentence about the particular learning outcome or the knowledge that you want to get from that particular MCQ question, that's a really useful way, because that can help you at the next stage when you separate the STEM, so the main sentence or the main body of the question, from the correct answer to create your question and correct answer sections. And then you devise the distractors. As we say, that's quite a complex and a difficult process potentially. So the main thing to think of there is the plausibility of the distractors, and making sure that they're roughly the same size and visually look the same, and those kinds of things. So there's lots of things to consider there. And then this idea of have someone try it out. Now this could be students, or it could be other teachers. So just to give you that kind of feedback loop, so it gives you an indication of how whether they're working well, whether there are any things that are not clear or accessible, and then going through the process of editing. So that's just a very broad overview of the key stages to help you going forward.
Okay, thank you so much. It's just really interesting to see everything behind these multiple choice questions. They're not just computer generated, we press a button and there we go. There's so much more thinking behind these things. In terms of actual practical application in the classroom and how a teacher can make really good use of these, I remember using multiple choice questions as starters and plenaries. So I would often build a quiz with additional activities, sort of if they get a question right they can score a goal in a game or something like that. And that was really good and a great way of enthusing learners, and it built up a massive enthusiasm to then review when you got a question wrong, or why was that wrong, or the whole class gets something wrong, can we explore that? And that's at times that felt too low level, but actually a good teacher can use such approaches to explore and say, well, why did we get that wrong? As Rachel was exploring earlier, and as Simon's explained, it's about how the teacher uses these things, and as part of a range of teaching techniques they can be so powerful. And I hope, as we've seen so far here, that multiple choice questions are not just for low level knowledge recall. An effective teacher can make really powerful use of them. I don't know if you've got any further thoughts.
Certainly think that the fact of getting, like you said earlier, the students writing their own questions. I mean, to write a question and devise some answers, you've got to really understand the subject. And I think delving deeply, and that different uses of them you talk about as well. I've seen them being used, and I use them in my own classroom, where each corner of a classroom is being given the answer, and students themselves physically move into the corner they think, and then they have a classroom debate about, well, you're wrong, no, you're right, and just standing back and just hearing the conversations that come about trying to convince the other people that they need to come. Because likewise, you say, if you all choose the right answer, you're all going to get a prize or whatever the system is within that establishment. But just there's so much richness that's available that is so unapparent when you just look at a question, and I think that's really, really important.
Okay, thank you. Simon, any more thoughts or ideas about next steps for use in class?
Yes, I think the idea of potential or richness potential of MCQs is something that it's useful to emphasise, because we think to ourselves that an MCQ sort of just leads to a certain outcome in terms of classroom interactions and so on. And again, we normally associate that with quite limited things as a general rule. Again, a common myth held, but just the examples that Rachel gave there just shows that you can use the same MCQ question in a variety of different ways. So that scope and that potential is actually much broader than perhaps you would initially think.
Yeah. I think there was one other thing I think we haven't mentioned as well, and that is the professional development, actually, of writing these, collaborating with your colleagues in school, sitting down and looking at a topic and deciding all the planning you talked about, and actually, particularly the Hinge questions for me, identifying what is that crux of this, what is that gatekeeper concept that I need to know that students understand for me to be able to move on in my teaching. How do I design those distractors? Am I trying to probe misconceptions, or what are the misconceptions? Looking back at students' books to help you decide what those misconceptions are going to be, or research as it stands, typical misconceptions in a particular area.
And that links really nicely to a thing we were sort of covering earlier. So I'll put this slide back on, the one we didn't see earlier about rich data. I believe this was Project Quantum. Simon, you were involved in this. A couple of things we could mention there.
Yeah, so Project Quantum, just for people that may not have come across it, is the idea of using crowdsourced multiple choice questions in a particular context. In this sense, it's computer science related questions. So the idea is that any teacher around the world can submit their questions to the project, and they're taken by students around the world, and the data comes through about the quality of those particular questions, and then they can be reviewed and analysed. So the idea is to create a huge item bank with really useful questions in computer science. So the data that you can get from it is really incredibly rich. So you can get information about the percentage of students that have chosen particular options. This is just an example here related to code, a couple of screenshots. But another thing that is built into this particular project, and maybe something for you to explore in your own context, is the idea of students giving an explanation behind why they've selected a particular response. And that can give you useful information, not just for people that have got the question incorrect, but also for those who have got it correct, because they may be arriving at the correct answer for the wrong reasons. So there could be misconceptions being shown there that you wouldn't necessarily have got without that qualitative information. So it can just be that extra source of data that can be incredibly useful for informing the next teaching steps.
Okay, thank you so much. And the final thing we're going to look at here is really just focusing on sort of 5 top tips that we feel emerge from here. And thank you both so much for sort of all your ideas and suggestions. It's such a huge amount of things to explore. For me, it's about using these as part of your teaching toolkit, your range of things that you have. So once you've done the quiz, once you've discussed it, what then happens? What's next? Do the learners have their a further quiz for them to create? Does that lead on to the next activity? Do half the learners get to use a different approach? So how do we make really effective use of these? So actually start those formative questions. I think as well, Simon, it's about a strategy as well.
Yes, so I mentioned before the idea of getting people to review items that have been or assessments that have been developed in the past, and developing a strategy around that. So for example, you may want to develop a checklist based approach, a resource that you can give to people around your particular context, school context, to help people review the quality of the multiple choice questions. There's also a lot of useful statistical data that you could collect about how the multiple choice questions have worked. So this, which are quite easily calculated, on spreadsheets and so on. They give you some really useful information about how difficult the MCQs were for students, how well it discriminated between the better students and the ones that didn't perform so well. So there's a lot of useful information around that, and developing a strategy to pick up on issues and the positive elements of how they've worked is something that I would definitely recommend.
Okay, and our third one there is to mention student ownership. We've mentioned this many times during this presentation. It's just about, it's not just enthusiasm to have a quick quiz because it's fun. We're actually using these for deep learning, exploring next steps where things can go. So that's sort of my third one there, and that sort of leads nicely on to the fourth one, Rachel.
Yeah, and I think it's this effective use. Why are you using a multiple choice earlier about, is it at the beginning of a series of lessons just to get a snapshot of where students are? Is it to compare that to the end? Is it to really probe at these misconceptions, and what are you going to do once you've got that? Are you going to discuss those, or is it this kind of idea of a hinge question, of a gatekeeper of, right, my class is ready to move on to the next concept which builds on this one? So it's really thinking about the purpose of your using them, and I think that helps you in the design of them as well.
And then Simon?
Yes, building on that point really. So in having those discussions, you probably have a sense across different teachers in your school or department. You may have a sense of, okay, I've got a roadmap for how I want to use particular MCQ questions at different times for different reasons. And so this idea about utilising the wisdom of the practitioners that are around you, and in some cases even the students as well, when looking at how developing and critiquing multiple choice questions and how well they've worked. And we mentioned before about the idea of crowdsourced assessments. So one thing you may want to consider is building an item bank across your school of questions that have really worked well. That's something that can be done. But also the building of the network and the community of practice around the use of multiple choice questions, the professional development experiences that can foster, traditionally are really quite powerful, and that cross-pollination, if you like, of expertise and understanding in relation to MCQ design is really quite really useful professional development.
Okay, and just to say thank you so much, both of you, for your time today. We will follow this presentation with many more links and suggestions about further opportunities from all organisations part of Cambridge Assessment. And so thank you very much for your time. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.